From the Toronto Star, I'm Reggie Mudler, and this matters. Containergeddon. That's one of the names being given to the long lineup of container ships waiting outside U.S. ports. This is a stark visual symbol of several disruptions to the global supply chain, which is resulting in product delays, higher prices, and shortages of items. If you tried to buy an appliance during this pandemic, you know it's not buyer beware, it's buyer be ready to wait. Yesterday, U.S. President Joe Biden enacted a number of measures to get the supply chain moving quicker. But because this is something that people don't care about until there's a problem, he first gave a mini lecture on what it is.
Well, let me explain. Supply chains essentially mean how we make things and how the material and parts get delivered to a factory so we can manufacture things, how we move things, how a finished product moves from a factory to a store to your home. And today we have an important announcement that will get things you buy to you to the shelves faster.
The U.S. president announced that the two West Coast ports that 40% of all goods that come to America go through will now operate on a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week basis as part of the plan to help open up the container ship traffic jam and get goods moving. But, as the name suggests, this is just one link in the supply chain, and there are plenty that are feeling the stress. Dr. David Johnston is the director of the George Weston Limited Center for Sustainable Supply Chains and the Master of Supply Chain Management program at the Schulich School of Business at York University. He joins to discuss the disruptions in the global supply chain, how they are affecting Canada, and when things might improve. David, thank you so much for making the time to join us today.
My pleasure, Reggie.
So, David, I want to talk about some of the truly extraordinary things that we are seeing, but I want to start at the beginning. I mean, one of the things is that most people don't really think about the supply chain until it's disrupted. Earlier this year, people saw the Ever Given getting stuck in the Suez Canal, but experts like yourself have been talking about these issues for about a year. I want to just sort of get to the basics about the cause. Is this all due to COVID, or are there a number of factors?
No, it isn't all due to COVID-19. COVID-19 exposed some of the fragilities of our global supply chains. But we had issues before COVID-19, and we can kind of get into some of the details of that. For instance, let me give you an example. We've all heard about there's a shortage of semiconductors that go into our appliances, our cars, our consumer electronics. We were approaching a situation where we're having capacity constraints, i.e. our ability to actually produce these chips and therefore the products that use them. We were already starting to hit the limit of how much we could produce with an ever-expanding demand for it. So, of course, when COVID-19 happens and we have this kind of what they call a bullwhip effect or this whiplash effect of a total drop in demand and, of course, closing of factories and reallocating of those capacities, and then our economy comes surging back again, of course, that's compounding that situation.
Where are we at right now? I mean, the big things is the images that people are seeing is these numbers of container ships that are just waiting at ports. I loved one article called it Containergeddon. How has this happened? Why are these ships all stuck there right now?
Well, actually, another term that actually might be helpful or expression that's come out is the bottleneck economy. And what I think we're discovering as consumers and also as professional people trying to procure products for our organizations is that basically we are in a chain or in a pipeline, and there's no different ways of looking at it, which have multiple companies or organizations buying and selling from each other. And what we find out is those various links in the supply chain have more or less ability to do work. And of course, when they're stressed, sometimes we find out where the weakest link is. And right now in the news, of course, literally this week, we're discovering one of the most constrained links in our supply chain is actually our ability to handle freight in ports and to get that freight out of the port. And of course, particularly in the news, of course, is what's happening in the United States in the port of Los Angeles. Interesting enough, of course, up in Canada here, we do not have exactly the same problem. We are actually being able to handle our what is called inbound freight quite effectively. There are stresses. There are, more demands on carriers, people or trucks and trains, boats and planes, as well as the workers that are driving those vehicles or the people that are working on the docks and loading these container ships and that sort of stuff. So that constraint that we're seeing, or that bottleneck we're seeing in the global supply chain, is not universally experienced in all parts of the world and not all ports of entry, of which, for instance, Los Angeles is a port of entry in the United States. We have ports of entry in Vancouver, and we have ports of entry in Halifax and Montreal, for instance.
Okay, you jumped ahead because I really do want to get to where we are in Canada, and I'm surprised to hear that it's not as bad.
Not as bad.
Not as bad. But I want to break this down for people who don't understand this. So let's talk about specifically the bottlenecks here at Los Angeles, and then talking about how they're going to try and fix them. One of the issues here is there's so many boats that are waiting. There are not enough trucks to get this stuff off. The truck drivers are waiting too long. I believe one of the things that I read is that normally they used to be able to do 2 loads a day, and now it's down to 1, and it's just not being cost effective for them. So they're leaving this business. Is this right? Is this the picture that's being painted correct?
Yep. And the only thing I would add to your description is the shortage of truck drivers. Something, by the way, that we knew before COVID-19 occurred. We were short of skilled drivers, and not only in the United States, but also here in Canada and other parts of the world. People don't want to be truck drivers.
Okay, so as you said, as a chain, it just seems like there's a massive domino effect here of problems that are just sort of exacerbating themselves. Too many boats waiting, not enough truck drivers, not enough people. And also, I think one of the big things is too much stuff. We've all just bought too many things during this pandemic. Is that also fair to say?
Yes, there has been a surge in demand. Some people call it kind of like revenge consumption. We've heard that with regards to the travel industry, but it's also true of the consumer goods industry. And of course, the goods that people are consuming are slightly different maybe than what they may have consumed before COVID-19. So yes, that's part of the compounding effect here is we are seeing, apart from some issues with capacity and talent, which we've now covered, 2 drivers of why we have these bottlenecks or supply disruptions. But the other thing is, of course, we are experiencing this surge, originally a depression in demand and then a surge in demand. And that's always tricky to deal with if you're a person who basically buys for a living. Now, one thing that might help your listeners, Raju, is just to realize that I think people are learning a little bit about supply chain management. And of course, as somebody who basically runs the supply chain management program in a business school, we have a master's of supply chain management at Schulich School of Business. We're discovering, of course, that it's getting easier to explain to the consumer and the general population why it's important and what the nature of the task is. And so most of us as consumers know the experience of basically going to a store and finding what we're looking for not being there and saying, well, oh, that's just disappointing. But for those people running the stores or the manufacturers putting the products in those stores, they have to start managing this like a science. And of course, we're there basically purchasing products, not just once, but repeatedly at volume. And so you get into a lot of discussions now, or have been accentuated just recently, about how do you basically make a reliable supply chain that just doesn't ship one thing and you get your order or you get your shipment in, but how do you do it on a repeat basis so that you can keep your customers happy over time or keep whoever you're buying for it. And it's not just customers. Sometimes it's making sure that you have the supply of the drugs and medical supplies to keep your hospitals running, or if it's a government agency, getting the supplies for your clients.
Before we move on, I just want to say, is there any other factors that we haven't covered?
You've covered a lot of them. I'm thinking of some of those things. We've got capacity constraints. We've got this effect of supply and demand moving, and think of it as a kind of a roller coaster going up and down is one way of looking at it, or a bullwhip, the tip of the whip going back and forth like that. So we've covered those things. We've got talent shortages, that's happening in some areas. And the technology is changing too. And that's a more longer term cycle right now. But what we're seeing is more of the compounding of those 3 things. Oh, and wait, there's more. There's one more thing I would add into that. Interesting thing happening in China that you probably have also read in the news, and most of your listeners would have. There are brownouts in various Chinese cities. And so what has happened is, of course, the electrical utilities, the power generation facilities, in some cases have kind of cut back on the amount of power they're generating, partially because there's emission controls being imposed by the government. And of course, this has created a scarcity of coal, which has driven up the price, which makes it uneconomical to supply more power. And therefore, you find factories closing down to conserve energy, or there's just no energy available. And of course, there's no products to put into that pipeline or that supply chain. So we actually might have an extra factor here is we have government policies. And we have, in some cases, the things that we're trying to do, as the Chinese government is trying to do, reduce emissions, which would be good for the environment and good for people's health, conflicting with the supply of products getting on the shelf here in North America or in other places in South Asia, where, of course, demand is also surging.
Okay, that's fascinating. I did not expect that one to be a thing as well. Okay, you already touched upon this a little bit. How is this manifesting itself, though, at the consumer level? You already mentioned chip shortages, appliances people are waiting along for. I just saw a president of the Toy Association saying that Christmas is coming. If there's something you really want to get, like now is the time to buy it if it's even available. Is this affecting everything?
Not everything. And of course, I'm sure there's pockets where there's supply. Food is going to be different than toys. And let's just look at the supply chain here. This is where consumers might want to think just beyond what they see on the shelf and ask themselves, where does that product come from? If they want to assess whether there could be a scarcity. It's complicated because you have to look not only one step, for instance, who's the person that brings it to the shelf, who's the supplier for that, but then who's the supplier for that supplier, right? So things like toys, and this is a great example. You'll find out, of course, a lot of them are sourced in places like China and South Asia and Southeast Asia. And of course, there are some problems with the containers, and there's issues with shipping, and there's backlogs. So yeah, they're very strongly impacted. So what the toy manufacturers are saying in some of their trade publications are quite interesting. They're saying that, we're maybe short on some of our shipments by 25%. We're finding in some cases there are price increases going along with that because there's scarcity. In other things such as food, which we of course tend to source a little bit more locally because there's perishability, and of course there's preferences about what food people like to eat. Less so because, for instance, we source a lot of it in North America. So what we're seeing is it's a bit of a patchwork where there seems to be greater constraints than others. So stepping back to your question, of course, is what I think consumers will find is that some products just are not going to be on the shelf. They stop maybe producing some of them, and the manufacturers focused on others so they can get that volume out there for, of course, the Christmas season coming. In other situations, depending on where it's sourced, there might be very good availability. So back to the recommendation, should you buy early? Well, I think this also is something that people would say as good advice to survive the holidays is, you should actually buy early, be purposeful in your purchases as to what's important. Go out and source those important things and make sure you have them in hand, because the most important thing in supply chain management at the end of the day is sometimes isn't the price you pay. It's whether you can get the product and it's of good quality.
We'll be right back. So, David, let's talk about how are people trying to solve this problem. I hear Walmart is chartering their own container ships. And then the big news was the White House announced a number of measures to at least deal with some of the port issues. Can we talk about that? How are people trying to fix this now? And I guess, is it going to work?
Well, one thing you always have as a supply chain manager or an operations manager when you're confronted with more demand than you have capacity to handle is you try to get everybody to work harder. And I think that in the short term is like sprinting. It can be very exhausting. In some cases, what you ideally want that's more sustainable is you establish a pace that's achievable by everybody that somehow matches that demand for products and services, right? That's the ideal situation. Of course, we're not in the ideal situation in a number of the commodities we consume here. So in the short term, it may work. In the long term, as we discovered throughout the whole COVID-19 crisis over the last year and a half, people sprinting, it can't be sustained. After a while, they've got to stop. They have to reconsolidate. We've all found that in our personal lives, right? So the question is how we get back out of sprinting and doing things like the President of the United States has requested, which is, of course, people in the Port of Los Angeles, working overtime and working 3 shifts and that sort of thing, and everybody who's in that chain doing likewise. And that's achievable. And of course, they're doing overtime. That's achievable. In the long term, what we should be looking at is making some strategic investments. And this is something that a number of our industry associations here in Canada are proposing to our federal government. That's investing in skills development so that we have more people. That's thinking of adding extra docks into our ports, thinking about improving our infrastructure, our roads and railways. These are just a few things. These obviously take more time, but if we're really responding to the fact that we don't like what we're seeing with these shortages and the price increases that might come with it and the kind of general uncertainty, then we have to think longer term about making investments in infrastructure and in people.
David, you touched on it earlier, but let's talk about Canada specifically. You mentioned that our ports are not having as many issues, but what is the situation like here?
As I said, it seems to be the reporting from the ports and from our logistic providers is that we're doing a relatively good job of it. It's not as severe. Is there stress on the system? Yes, there is stress on it. And of course, we're going to have to come back and look at those long-term enablers of having a smooth flow of product across what is a very vast geography in Canada. So it's just a question of we have a little more capacity relative to the demand. And that's mainly the one thing that's happening here. We're not seeing the same volume. We'll know a little bit better as the season progresses as to maybe there's a different consumption pattern that's happening. I think Canadian supply chain management people are doing a great job too. They're thinking ahead. Canadians generally are a globally thinking people. They think ahead about, what could be happening to my supplier in Vietnam? What could be happening to my customer that I ship to in Europe? And anticipating these things. And I think that's very true in general for large organizations. I'm thinking of the major retailers out there who have people that are professional buyers and professional logisticians and professional demand planners out there who actually, are competent and are thinking ahead. And so some of them have actually done some proactive actions to be prepared so that they aren't as greatly affected by supply disruption. And you've probably heard of some retailers going out and, for instance, chartering their own ship to make sure that they can get their products from A to B. The other thing is, and I think of the toy industry and some of the other manufacturers and some of the other retailers, some of the organizations basically took on more inventory. They bought ahead, what they call forward buy, and they warehoused the product in anticipation of the surge that happens during the Christmas buying season. And they realized it was going to cost them a lot more to buy and hold these things. It takes money to buy inventory. It takes money to put them in a warehouse, but not pass them on and get the money from selling it to somebody. But they made that investment to make themselves more resilient and shock-proof themselves. So I would like to think that in Canada, we've done a good job, but I also know in the United States and in Europe and in also retailers in Asia, the ones that are very progressive and are very competent at supply chain management were doing exactly that. They could see the writing on the wall, partially due to COVID-19, that there was going to be these undulations, these booms and busts in demand. And the worst thing that could happen to them is not to have product available. Even though they might pay a little bit more for it, it might cost them more to have it, and they might not have all the variety that they would like to have for their consumers.
This is fantastic for us to be wrapping up soon. Here's the thing, crystal ball. A lot of people are saying that there's a chance, a hope that this gets to normal by maybe the middle of next year. What are your thoughts on that?
I can hope along with consumers and I can hope along with retailers and manufacturers that actually happens. And we do hear projections that the COVID-19 part of it, this undulation of this roller coaster part will calm down. It's just like waves after a storm on the ocean is eventually the winds die down and the ocean calms down. And I think it'll take a little while to work through our economy, and people are talking about it will be into 2022, obviously, for that. Maybe some things trailing into 2023. We'll see. In the longer term, some of these situations that were mounting before COVID-19, and let's go back to semiconductors, it takes time to build a fabrication facility for semiconductors. For instance, just buying the machinery that goes into those factories is an 18-month waiting time. So it's going to take a while to add that extra capacity. And in the meantime, the demand for those products are continuing to grow as consumption of all the things that have microchips in it increase. That includes our cars, appliances, toys, cell phones, those sort of things. So Looking long range, crystal balling it a little bit, is we will continue to work through the diminishing waves of the ripples from COVID-19. We'll need to confront the places where we have capacity constraints because we don't have enough factories. And we'll also have to work through the constraints that our infrastructure, our supply chain infrastructure, has shown to be weak. Will people, and you started earlier in this podcast asking me, are we going to see a change in consumption? And this is a very interesting long-term thing to think about. Has COVID-19 changed people's consumption patterns such maybe they consume less? The other thing that is, as we get away from COVID-19 or come to terms with living with it, is we have other existential crises, such as, we have global warming. And as the governments move on that, we'll also create some constraints on the supply chain. We'll create the need for investment that could potentially disrupt supply chains. And how that will affect our supply will be interesting. But the other interesting thing, of course, is as people are concerned about this, will that change their consumption? And because one of the best ways to have a more sustainable economy is for people to consume less, recycle, reuse, repurpose. For instance, the other one that strikes us, it means maybe manufacturers and the people that are, you're short of appliances and you're short of cars and that sort of thing. Wouldn't it be great if these cars and appliances were more repairable and therefore you didn't have to worry about stuffing the supply chain with more and more new product? You could just basically reuse and make it last a little longer. So lots of changes happening here in the long term that could help us avoid these supply disruptions in the future. And there will be a few issues that could have a disruptive effect on the supply chain that we're going to have to come to terms with if we're going to have a sustainable supply chains in a number of areas.
Well, David, I think this has opened a lot of people's eyes considering some of the problems, and I hope that those changes are coming for all of our sakes. I really, really want to thank you for your time and your expertise today.
My pleasure.
Dr. David Johnston is the director of the George Weston Limited Center for Sustainable Supply Chains and the Master of Supply Chain Management program at the Schulich School of Business at York University. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm your host, Raju Mudler. Our This Matters team is Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bochneck, Saba Etizaz, and Sean Pattenden. Our music is by So-Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattenden. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.